It is the last week of August, and there are 4 different composting systems sitting in the same backyard. Over along the fence, a quiet pile of last fall's leaves that nobody has touched since April. 10 feet away, a fresh pile still steaming a little in the cool of the morning. Out in the garage, a bucket with a sealed lid, slowly filling with kitchen scraps. And under the kitchen sink, a worm bin. On the back steps sits a flat of cabbage seedlings, roots already circling the bottom of the cells, maybe a week before they have to go in the ground. 4 systems, 1 deadline. Which one will actually be ready, and which one only looks ready? That second half is the one that costs people a season, and almost nobody asks it out loud. Start there, and the rest gets simple. Here's the thing most composting advice gets wrong. It talks about composting like there is 1 clock running. There are 3, and they finish at different times. The first one is the breakdown clock. That is the one everybody watches. It is the stretch where a pile of leaves and grass and scraps stops looking like leaves and grass and scraps. Pieces get smaller, color goes dark, volume drops by half. That clock is easy to read. You can watch it happen. The second clock is the curing clock, and this is where gardens get lost. After the fast part of decomposition finishes, the material still needs quiet time to settle down, and while it is settling, it can still do real damage to a young root. The microbes that are still working in there are hungry for nitrogen, so they pull it away from your seedlings instead of feeding them. That is called nitrogen immobilization, and it is the reason a bed can look beautifully amended and still grow pale, stunted plants. Unfinished material can also carry ammonia, which burns roots, and it can carry organic acids and other compounds that are simply toxic to a sprouting seed. The folks at the University of Florida IFAS Extension put it plainly. Immature compost contains phytotoxins that will often kill a seed embryo outright. A seed does not get a second chance at that. The third clock is the one you control least. The garden clock. The date those cabbage plants have to leave the flat and go in the dirt, whether or not anything else is ready. Frost does not negotiate. A root-bound seedling does not wait. So asking which method is fastest means nothing by itself. Fast on which clock? A pile can finish the breakdown clock in a month and still be 6 weeks from safe in a seed row. And a pile that cooled off 2 weeks ago is not finished. It is just quiet. Before we walk through the 4 systems, run a quick check on your own situation, because the right answer changes completely with your answers. It takes about a minute, and it is worth more than anything else here. First, how many weeks until you have to plant? Not how many weeks you would like, how many you actually have. Count them. Second, what is piling up at your place right now? Leaves, fresh grass, spent tomato vines, kitchen scraps, weeds that already went to seed, manure from a neighbor with horses. Each one wants to go somewhere different, and sending them all to the same pile is how good gardeners end up with a weed nursery. Third, do you need bulk or a little of something concentrated? Filling a raised bed is one problem. Giving 12 transplant holes a boost is a different problem, and a much easier one. Fourth, and this is the one people fudge. How much can you lift, dig, and turn without paying for it the next day? That is not a weakness. That is a design specification, the same as any engineer works with. Fifth, what does your fall and winter look like? A gardener in Georgia and a gardener in Minnesota are running 2 different machines even if they build the exact same pile, because cold slows everything down. And sixth, anything risky in the material? Weed seed, diseased leaves, manure, hay or clippings that might carry herbicide residue. Hold that last one. It deserves its own conversation and most videos skip it. 4 machines, 4 different jobs. Start with the one everybody underrates. Cold composting is what happens when you pile up yard waste and mostly leave it alone. Most people describe it as hot composting that failed. That is backwards. It is a deliberate choice. And for a lot of gardeners, it is the smartest one on the list, because it is the only system that asks almost nothing of your back. Oregon State University Extension puts a cool pile at roughly 3 to 6 months, or longer. That word longer is doing real work. Coarse material, no water, a cold, dry winter, and you are closer to a year. But here is the trade. No turning schedule, no ratio arithmetic, no inoculant to buy, because the leaves already carry every decomposer they need. You add material when you have it, in a bucket you can actually carry, and time does the labor. What cold composting does well is store carbon. Autumn leaves show up free, in bulk, at exactly the moment you have the least energy to handle them, and a wire ring or pallet bay near the bed where you will use it is enough. Mix clumping grass in with dry leaves so it does not mat into a slimy layer that shuts out air and smells like ammonia. What it does not do is get hot. Oregon State is direct about this. A cold pile does not reach temperatures that reliably kill most weed seeds, and plant diseases riding in on leaves or on soil stuck to roots can survive it too. So keep problem weeds out. If you are unsure about a batch, spread it in one small area first and watch what comes up before you trust it garden-wide. Honest fall verdict. A cold pile started at the end of August is a spring soil account, not cash you can spend in October. Which sounds like bad news until you remember most of what you build in fall is for spring anyway. Now the one everybody wants to talk about. Hot composting is the only one of these four that can process a large volume in a hurry. When it works, it is impressive. But it only works when 5 things line up at once, and if one is missing, you have an expensive cold pile. You need mass. Oregon State puts the working minimum near 1 cubic yard, a pile 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and 3 feet tall. Smaller than that, and heat escapes faster than the microbes make it. You need a real share of green, nitrogen-rich material mixed with dry browns. Moisture like a wrung-out sponge. Air, which means enough coarse material that the pile does not pack down. And you need to restack when it starts to cool, usually in the first 5 to 10 days, pulling the outside into the middle. Now here is the part that gets left out. And it is the whole reason people plant into material that hurts them. When gardeners talk about hot compost, killing weed seeds and pathogens, they are borrowing the authority of a standard that was never written for a backyard. The Department of Agriculture organic rules do set a benchmark. Feedstock must hold between 131 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days in an enclosed or aerated system, or 15 days in a windrow with at least 5 turnings. Those procedures came from federal guidelines for treating biosolids, and they arrive with documentation, monitoring, and inspection. So when you push a thermometer into the middle and see 131 degrees, you have learned that the middle was hot at that moment. You have learned nothing about the material 6 inches from the edge, where it is always cooler. That is what turning is for. It moves the outside into the hot zone. One reading is a snapshot, not a certificate. And then comes the second finish line. When the pile stops heating, most people call it done and start hauling. Oregon State recommends something different. After about a month, once the pile has come back down to the temperature of the air around it and does not reheat when you turn it, let it cure for another 4 to 6 weeks before you use it with tender seedlings or in a vegetable bed. Around established shrubs and trees, you can use it sooner, and that is a useful place to put material you are unsure about. Do the addition, and the honest planning window for a brand new hot pile, aimed at young roots, is somewhere around 8 to 10 weeks under good conditions. Longer in cool fall weather, longer with woody material, longer if you cannot turn it. That is not a rule carved in stone. It is a planning number, and the pile itself always gets the final vote. If turning a cubic yard is not something your shoulders will enjoy, a length of perforated pipe stood in the middle can help air move through when frequent turning is not realistic. It may help. What it does not do is prove every part of that pile got treated. Air pipes are not a substitute for heat and mixing. Fall verdict. Hot compost is the only system here that can produce real volume on a fall timetable, and it is still not a guarantee. If you are planting in 2 weeks, do not start one and hope. The full decision framework is coming, but one thing first. We are about to add 2 more systems and a stack of conditions, and nobody remembers that from a video. I put all of it into a printed guide called the Fall Compost Decision Chart, which walks you through choosing a system by your deadline, your waste, your space, and how much lifting you want to do. The link is in the description. Print it, leave it on the shelf in the garage. Now, the bucket in the garage. Bokashi confuses people because it gets filed under composting, and it is not composting. It is fermentation. You layer food scraps in a sealed bucket with an inoculated bran carrying lactic acid bacteria and yeasts, press the material down to push out air, and keep the lid shut. The microbes pickle it instead of rotting it. That is why it can take meat, dairy, and cooked food that has no business in an open pile, and why it lives happily in a garage. Washington State University Extension lays out the timing clearly. Once the bucket is full, you let it ferment sealed for about 10 to 14 days. And then, and this is the part the marketing tends to skip, you are only halfway. What comes out of that bucket is pre-compost. It is acidic, it is biologically active, and it is not finished. Open a good one and the food still looks like food. That is normal. Fermentation preserves structure. What you check is smell. Sour and tangy, like a pickle crock. White mold on top is a good sign. If it smells rotten, sulfurous, or like ammonia, or the mold is green, black, or blue, the seal or the brand failed and that batch goes in the trash. The second stage is where the actual breakdown happens. Washington State says to dig a hole or trench roughly 8 to 12 inches deep. Put in a layer of ferment an inch or two thick. Mix it with at least 2 or 3 times its volume in soil and cover it completely. Then you wait. About 2 weeks in warm, biologically active soil. 3 to 4 weeks in cool or compacted soil. 4 weeks or more in containers. 4 things you do not do. Do not spread it on the surface like mulch. Do not put it against roots, stems, or trunks. Do not plant into it right away. And do not dump a large volume in one concentrated pocket. On the liquid that drains out, be careful what you believe. A pilot study published this year in the journal Fems Microbes followed 6 household Bokashi practitioners. The communities were dominated by lactic acid bacteria, and applying the ferment or the leachate to soil supplied nutrients and organic acids, but did not substantially change the soil's overall microbial community. 6 households is a small study, so hold it loosely. But it is a fair check on the idea that a cup of bucket drippings transforms your soil biology. One more caution. Some guidance says the acidity of Bokashi kills pathogens and weed seeds. Other guidance says it suppresses them. You cannot verify which happened in your bucket, so do not use Bokashi as a disposal route for seed heads or diseased plants and assume they were handled. Fall verdict. Bokashi is excellent waste management, and it can contribute to a fall bed if you start early enough to include both stages and your soil is still warm when the second one begins. Which brings us to the worms, and to the expectation I most often have to walk back. Worm composting deserves its popularity. Quiet, compact, nothing to turn, and the finished material is genuinely good. What it cannot do is fill a raised bed on short notice. The universities give different timelines, and I would rather hand you both than average them into a number that belongs to nobody. Utah State University Extension says a new bin generally takes 2 to 3 months to produce a good amount of vermicompost. Oregon State puts it at 3 to 6 months from setup to finished worm compost. Either way, a bin you start this week is not fall material. An established bin can give you a modest harvest right now. Use it where concentration matters. A handful in a transplant hole. A scoop in a seed row. A light top dressing an inch or two around a plant, not touching the stem. Oregon State suggests roughly a quarter of the volume when you blend a container mix. What you should not do is treat castings as bed filler. They are more concentrated and a little saltier than ordinary compost, so using them as bulk is expensive and unnecessary. 2 hard limits. A worm bin never gets hot, so it does not kill weed seed. Oregon State notes tomato, squash, and cucumber seeds ride straight through and sprout in the finished castings. And worms do not sanitize risky manure or diseased plants. That is not their job. On temperature, Utah State and Oregon State agree. Worms do best between 55 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Near freezing they survive, but nearly stop working. Approaching 90 degrees can kill them. So a hot climate bin needs shade, and a cold climate bin needs a garage, basement, or real insulation. 3 changes make a bin easier on your body. Raise it to waist height. Harvest by migration, pushing old material to one side and feeding only the fresh side for a few weeks, so the worms walk over on their own instead of you sorting by hand. And take material out in small scoops instead of lifting the whole bin. Before you choose any of this, one checkpoint worth ruling out. Your soil may not need more compost at all. Oregon State researcher Mael Nelson sampled 27 urban gardens over 2 years. Average organic matter came in around 13%, well above the 3 to 5% minimum commonly cited. One bed built entirely from compost reached about 30%, and the peppers in it burned and died by the end of the season. His colleague James Cassidy points out that phosphorus builds up over the years, especially with repeated manure-based composts. Those percentages are not a universal target for every soil in every region. But adding compost out of habit, without knowing what is already down there, is not automatically a favor to your garden. A soil test may be the cheapest move on this list. The best setups I know are handoffs, not contests. Plenty of leaves and limited energy. Run a cold leaf bank for spring and an elevated worm bin for scraps. Plenty of garden residue and somebody to help you turn. Run a managed hot pile, cure it, then test it. Small garden, Bokashi for difficult food and worms for clean plant scraps. Cold climate, store leaves, protect the worms, and do not assume the Bokashi second stage keeps moving once soil goes cold. Hot climate, shade the worms and watch moisture, because heat dries a pile faster than it composts it. Here is the part you came for. Count your weeks and find yourself planting in the next 2 weeks. No system you start today will produce safe finished compost in bulk. Use compost you have already verified, or plant without forcing immature material into the root zone, which is a perfectly respectable choice. Start a system now for the next planting window instead of sacrificing these seedlings to it. 3 to 6 weeks. Bokashi can realistically finish both stages if you manage it closely and your soil is still warm. A new hot pile may break down but is unlikely to get enough curing time for tender seedlings. Established castings are usable. A new worm bin and a new cold pile are not. 8 to 10 weeks or more. A well-managed hot pile plus curing becomes realistic in good conditions. Bokashi has a comfortable window. An established worm bin can contribute a little. Cold compost is still building toward spring. Planting next spring. Now cold compost is the rational choice and the pressure is off. Those are planning windows, not promises. The material decides, not the calendar. If none of the 4 fit, there is one more option. In-place and trench composting means burying material directly, and Oregon State describes a trench 12 to 18 inches deep, filled in fall and turned onto the bed in spring. It costs nothing. But I will not call it the easy choice, because digging that deep and moving the soil back is real work. If your back, knees, or balance are a question, hand it to somebody else or skip it. And like cold composting, it is preparation for spring, not a rescue. Quick routing so nothing lands in the wrong place. Dry leaves, cold pile or brown reserve. Fresh grass, thin layers mixed with dry material, never a wet mat. Healthy crop residue, hot or cold depending on volume and deadline. Weeds gone to seed, a genuinely managed hot system or out with the yard waste. Diseased plants, keep them out unless your extension office says otherwise for that disease. Fruit and vegetable scraps, worms, a protected bin or Bokashi. Meat, dairy, and cooked food, Bokashi and nowhere else. Manure, a managed hot pile, and if it stays raw, the organic standard is a useful reference. 120 days before harvest if the edible part touches soil, 90 days if it does not. Wood chips and twigs, structure and mulch, not a fast finish ingredient. And now the one almost nobody warns you about, herbicide residue. Certain broadleaf herbicides used on pasture and lawns survive the whole trip. Through the hay, through the animal, through the manure, through composting, into your beds. Oregon State has documented compost and soil mixes carrying this residue, and the damage shows up as cupped, twisted, fern-like growth on tomatoes, beans, peas, and potatoes. A hot pile does not solve it, so ask before you accept a load. Where did this come from, and was anything sprayed? If you cannot get a clear answer, plant a few bean or pea seeds in a pot of that material beside a pot of ordinary soil and watch for 2 or 3 weeks. That is a $2 test that has saved whole gardens, which leaves the last skill, reading the material itself. 4 things. Temperature. It is back down to the temperature of the air and does not heat up again after you moisten and turn it. If it reheats, it is still working. Smell. Earthy, like a forest floor. Not ammonia, not sulfur, not sharply sour. Appearance. Dark and crumbly. The original ingredients mostly unrecognizable, allowing for a few woody pieces. And time. It got a real curing period, not just a day of cooling. For one more layer of confidence, the University of Florida IFAS Extension describes a simple pot test. Plant radish seeds in your compost. If 3/4 or more sprout and grow into radishes, it is ready for any use. Radishes are used because they come up fast and they are honest about bad conditions. But be clear about what that test tells you. It tells you the material is mature enough not to poison a seedling. It says nothing about weed seeds, nothing about pathogens, and nothing about herbicide residue. Those are process questions, decided by what went in and what happened to it, not by what it looks like coming out. So where does that leave you? Cold compost when you have time and little labor to spend. Hot compost when you need bulk fast and can manage volume, moisture, heat, and curing. Bokashi, when difficult kitchen waste and small space are the real problems and the calendar has room for stage 2. Worms, when you want a steady supply of something concentrated rather than bulky. And if you have 2 weeks, the honest answer is the one nobody likes to say out loud. None of the systems you start today will make the bulk finished compost your seedlings need. That is not a failure. That is this year's calendar. Plant well anyway and start building for the next one. This weekend, write down 3 things: your planting date, your biggest waste stream, and the heaviest job you never want to do again. Those 3 answers will choose your system more reliably than any list of best methods. The Fall Compost Decision Chart walks you through exactly that, with the deadline windows, the routing chart, the maturity checklist, and the worm and Bokashi guides. The link is in the description. One last thing. What is piling up at your home right now? Leaves, grass, kitchen scraps, or weeds, and how many weeks remain before you need that bed? Tell me in the comments. And if your parents or grandparents had their own way of handling garden waste, I would truly like to hear it.